Good evening, everyone. This is Sachin Karnik here. Today is the 27th of February, 2025. I want to welcome you all to our continuing exploration of the religious traditions of the world. We are examining the Abrahamic traditions to begin with. Specifically, we've been looking at the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. But in connection to that, many other ideas that pop up. And so we're not really restricted to a very strict framework. We can continue our exploration in many different ways. To continue from the last several talks and contemplations, today I want to give a good half an hour exposition on divine will and human will. So I will speak for straight 25 minutes, half an hour or so, and then we'll open it up for conversation, discussion, etc. This question of divine will versus human will is an extremely profound question, and it has been debated for thousands of years by all of humanity in various religious traditions. Across civilizations, cultures, traditions, this dynamic interplay has shaped moral codes, theological doctrines, philosophical inquiries, and mystical experiences. So, what does this mean? What is meant by divine will versus human will? Well, let's see if we can probe that a bit further. If we begin from where we are, if we begin from our life experiences, we have our own sense of will, meaning agency, that I want to do this, I can do this. Our sense of freedom, our sense of free will, we have that. We tend to have that. Well, all right, assume that that's the case. Then what about divine will, or what is known as God's will? Is there such a thing? Is there such a thing as God's will? And is there such a thing as our will? Is our will the same as God's will? Interesting question. So let's make some assumptions. Since we're covering the Abrahamic traditions, there's the assumption of a monotheistic God, right? There's that sense that there's one supreme being that is the divine Lord in heaven or beyond heaven, maybe even that kind of thing. Okay, well, if that's the case, is God's will 100% complete, that God can do anything, God can do everything? God is the all-doer, the omnipotent being. So divine will and God and our will. Now, if you go, let's go back to the Genesis story for where the creation of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Who created the tree of knowledge of good and evil? According to the Hebrew Bible, that is God. He's the one who has created everything, right? Why did He create that? We don't know. We don't have any answer to that question in terms of those traditions. I don't want to mix up different traditions here. So in terms of the Abrahamic traditions, which means Judaism, Christianity, Islam, this question as to why God created the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, why God created anything. If God is all existent, the Alpha, the Omega, the eternal being, what is the purpose of creating heaven or Eden or Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? And why create any of that thing? God has nothing better to do than to create all this mess, and then to create this tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then make it a forbidden fruit. And then He's omniscient, so He knows that people are going to eat from that. Somebody's going to eat from that. Eve is going to eat from that, and then all the pain and suffering and the progeny and all the mess that happens. If God is actually there and all existing, this is the question, and all benevolent and all merciful, and there's divine will, God does everything. Doesn't He have even that much sense to just stop all this pain and suffering, just end it all? Why can't He do that? If you say that He cannot do that, here's the problem theologically. If you say that He cannot do that, that means He's not God, that He's not omnipotent. There's a logical problem. If you say that you can do it, but He's not doing it, then that would mean that He doesn't have compassion, full compassion. We as human beings, if like any of us, just 4 people online right now, if any of us was to ask, do we want to stop all killing in the world, all conflict in the world, all pain and suffering in the world? I think all 4 of us would probably say yes. that we want to stop that. So why God doesn't do that? He doesn't even have that much sense to do that. Do you see the problem here? These are the arguments atheists make. Now, this is very difficult to explain in many ways theologically, because theologians have tried to explain these types of questions, like why God doesn't stop pain and suffering if God is there. So then they say we cannot know God's whole purpose. But the atheistic argument is that's a foolish statement to make. You don't know the whole purpose. You don't know. In fact, what they're saying is that humanity has created the concept of God. That the atheist, I'm just trying to present this objectively, just to get some context. So the arguments against it have also been discussed before. But you could say that if there is divine will, that there is the supreme being, supreme Lord, and one would have to take that on faith. The existence of God, one would have to take that on authority or faith, or some type of philosophical religious reasoning, that there is a supreme cause of all causes, the supreme entity, supreme being, something like that, that is infinite, that is beyond all, and it's a matter of faith, that's all. Otherwise, one winds up in atheism and agnosticism. And in atheism, then the entire exploration ends right there. You cannot go further. You just say, well, there's nothing like that. Then person lives a materialistic life, and it ends right there. And there are people like that. Many of those people, not many, but some portion of those individuals then subscribe to something called hedonism, which is pleasures of the senses. Just go after that. Eat, drink, and be merry, the all different kinds of bodily pleasures, material pleasures, enjoyments. That's all there is. When a person dies, there's nothing, there's no heaven, there's no God, there's no soul, there's no mind, there's nothing. So this is called hard atheism, or it's called atheistic viewpoint. And there are many people in the world today who subscribe to such a thing. They have subscribed to, there's philosophical reasonings and arguments and all those things about this. Okay, now if we say that no, we don't accept that, there really is God. All right, if you say that there really is God, how do you know that? Because the Bible says so? Because the Old Testament said so? Because Moses said so? Because Jesus said so? Because somebody else said so? These were all human beings, weren't they? Jesus was a human form like us. Moses was human form like us. So did they just make up all of this thing? Just like in India, for example, you had stories upon stories upon stories of the different gods and different metaphysical things going on and all that. And people have written them down. Is it just all cock and bull stories in India also? Is that what it is? The Puranas and all the different stories that are there. Or people who have come on the planet, who are kings like Rama and Krishna. Are they just kings? People glorified them and turned them into gods thousands of years later? Is that what's happened? That's a viewpoint also. There's something called radical humanism, if you're taking notes. Radical humanism is a viewpoint that all of these religious traditions are all man-made. They're made to control people. They're made to try to instill certain morals and values, and then the historical figures have been turned into gods. Like, for example, Mahatma Gandhi. He hasn't been turned into a god yet, but in a place like India, he could easily be turned into a god. It takes only about 2 or 3 years to turn anybody into a god in India. It's not hard at all. And the reason behind that is because of the general public. They're ready to follow almost anybody over there. There's thousands of cases like that. So what is all of this? Is that what is going on here? That humanity in its historical traditions have taken human beings, turned them into divine figures like Ram and Krishna and Jesus and Muhammad and Guru Nanak and all, who knows, the whole list goes on. And then they have also created the idea of transcendental God. Well, if somebody accepts that, then all you're left with is materialism, and then that notion of God delusion, and then the mind just retracts from religion and spirituality. Still, a person may be very ethical. Like the philosopher Sam Harris talks about all this type of stuff that I'm talking about right now. That this is what they say, right? So this is difficult. If you are a believer in God, and you start reading these atheistic books, your whole belief in everything could be completely gone. Very possible. if you start reading books on atheism, and then you start reading books on theism, and an objective study is one thing. People who are deep believers in any tradition, their faith can be completely shattered and gone. Unless you are strong in your study to really counteract all of those other arguments, and that's not easy to do. You see, it's not easy to do. I'm not saying you should be doing that. I'm just trying to give a little perspective here. Simply because when we talk about questions like divine will and human will, it raises a basic question. If God exists, why God doesn't stop all the pain, suffering, trauma, the horror show that is going on in this world from time to time? God cannot stop that? Or just a good ethical human being, if you ask that person, would you like to stop it? They would say yes. So who is greater, God or just a simple ethical human being? And if God cannot stop it, that means there's no God, or just some human invention, or God doesn't have omnipotency. There's some problem somewhere. Right? That's the logic. That's the so-called logic. But the theological people will say, now let's look at the other side of this. The religious people will say you cannot know the divine will. The divine is transcendent. We cannot understand God's mind. We cannot even understand our mind thoroughly. How are we going to understand God's mind? So, and it isn't that God has been created by human beings, that there is the divine being that has created everything, the source of everything, but that is beyond our human framework. So to access that, you need faith. This is the idea. Faith in the revealed scriptures, faith in the various bona fide traditions, faith in the scriptures of the world, faith in the words of Jesus. Like what Jesus said, you have seen me, you have seen the Lord. So he's asking people to follow him at that time. And then the divinity, the recognition of that. And then on that path, one can try to progress further and see if there really is the divine, what that is exactly. You see, so that means that one would have to really accept, or it has to make sense somehow internally, that there is the supreme God, there is revealed through the scriptures, that the people like Moses and the prophets of the Old Testament and Jesus and all the theologians that came, that these are not liars, that they're not just lying, or they're just not making things up, basically, that they're talking about something that really exists, and they want to take us there. They want to open that doorway into that higher consciousness. Okay. Well, so let's assume for that's the case. Even then, the question of divine will comes into the picture. If we say that God's will is sovereign, God is the ultimate sovereign, the lawgiver, and all these things we've talked about already. People are disobedient. Their disobedience was there because of eating the forbidden fruit, and then it goes on, and then the disobedience continues, and then the dualities are created. Okay, so then our will is also created. Where did that come from? So if we say that God is divine will, where is our will? So assume, now let's go forward on this. Assume for a moment that there is God. Assume for a moment that the Old Testament story is true. Just take it as at face value. Leave all the other atheism and all those things on the side for the time being. Let's now stay on this track further. Just assume that that's the case, just the way it is written in the Old Testament. All right? That means that the forbidden fruit was eaten. Then God puts those cherubim, those guardians, to prevent the entry back into Eden, back into heaven. The description in the Genesis is a sword that is going in all directions, like a flaming sword or something like that. It prevents the people from coming back into heaven because they've fallen out of heaven. Just assume that there is something like that. Whatever it might be, assume that that's the case. Okay, then what? Then, because it was a forbidden tree, the argument that can be made is that, well, you've disobeyed, now you have to deal with it. It's just the way it goes. You open the door into that lower dimension of knowledge and good, of tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and you open that doorway, then God does intervene. In the Old Testament, you will see God intervenes again and again and again. He gives 10 commandments. He gives all kinds of teachings. There's some over 600 commandments in the Old Testament, by the way. It's not just the 10 commandments. There's quite a few of them, and all throughout, where he has given specific instructions and things to do. Something like 630 or something like that. It's a large number. It's over 600. So, if that's the case, that would mean that human beings have a sense of free will. Once they eat that forbidden fruit, then you come into the material world. That's where the free will comes from. And so that free will can be stated. It has to connect with God again. The free will we have, can it connect with the divine again? Through prayer, through religious traditions, through scriptural studies, things like that. See, for example, that's why people do Bible study, right? Why do people do Bible study? They do that because that is a way to discover what is God's will. That's one thing. And then to retune one's will to that divine will. Thy will be done, thy kingdom come, as it is in heaven, so on earth. Right? This idea. That my will is my own ego, my own limited things that I want to do. But what is your will? So that is revealed in the scriptures and then the various commentaries and whatnot. Right? So there may be a way to bridge my will with the divine will. But that would mean having faith in what is meant by the divine, having faith in scriptures, having faith in religious texts, and then using them as a basis, and then the different teachers and whoever has come, what they're saying, it makes sense, logical sense, and then traveling that path. One would have to travel a path that has been laid out in each of the traditions. For example, if someone is a Jewish person, they would have to travel one or more of the paths that are laid up in Judaism. There's quite a few of them. The same thing is true in Christianity. You've got so many denominations. Yeah, it's centered around Jesus, but there's many ways to approach Jesus, who he is. Interpretations vary. Paths vary also. Right? So one would have to travel a path to see what benefit there is in that path. The same thing is true in the Eastern traditions. Someone, let's say, is a Buddhist, says that I want to, or wants to be a Buddhist. Well, they have to follow the Eightfold Path. They have to study Buddhism. They have to go to the Buddhist temples and monasteries and really steep themselves in that and then discover what's in it and then go into it further. See, these are not superficial endeavors. These are very, very profound endeavors. Same thing is true in the Hindu tradition. If you go into any of the different multitude of paths there, whatever they are, there's devotional ones, there's non-dualistic ones, there's all different kinds of paths there. So if you go into any one of them, it requires time to see what it is, study it, find out what the great teachers are teaching, what are the steps to be taken, and then start walking in that direction, and ultimately bring it inside, contemplate inside, bring the path inside. Is it making sense? So like in Christianity, the focus is on Jesus and the New Testament. And then, of course, the commentaries and all the different individuals that have talked about Jesus' life or have commented on that. So scholarly pursuit is one thing, but if one is pursuing through faith, that's a different matter. So now you're leaving that atheism stuff and that's gone completely then. So leave that aside for the time being. Leave agnosticism, atheism. I would even say just a scholarly analysis is also not sufficient. You could have a scholarly analysis. It's not sufficient. Well, the reason it's not sufficient is because just because one is a scholar in the New Testament doesn't mean that they have faith in Jesus. Doesn't mean that they're actually following Christianity. There's quite a few scholars on Christianity. There's quite a few scholars on Christianity that do not follow Christianity. There's quite a few scholars on the Bhagavad Gita that do not follow the Hindu tradition or the Indian tradition. There's quite a few scholars who are proficient in Buddhism that don't follow Buddhism. They might be Christians or they might be atheists or whatever they might be, or they might be Hindus, right? Or they might not belong to any of these categories. So scholarship by itself doesn't mean one is a believer. As I may have mentioned to you before, at the University of Tennessee, I had met a religious studies scholar who knew the Bhagavad Gita, the 700 verses inside out. He was an American fellow, Caucasian fellow. And he was a scholar, he wasn't somebody from India and all that. He's actually brought up in the U.S. and was loved Eastern traditions. And I think he was a staunch Christian, if I'm not mistaken. But he knew the Gita inside out. I mean, I had long conversation with him about it. I had some questions, in fact. I was a student at that time. And I went to see him, and I wasn't part of their religious studies or anything. I was in the social work field, but I knew this scholar was there. So, he's got scholarship. He knows the verses. He knows the Sanskrit language. He's a Sanskrit scholar. It's amazing. I mean, how deeply he knows. But he's not a practicing Hindu. You see, that's what's interesting. And you could have the same thing. People could be very, very deeply knowledgeable about the New Testament, and they're not practicing Christianity. They may not even go to a church. They might study about churches and things like that. They may not belong to any particular church or even do online prayers or anything like that. They just are scholars. That's it. It begins there and it ends there. It's like a profession. Maybe it's a profession for them. Maybe it's just a hobby or an interest, and it ends there. In fact, I was watching somebody on YouTube, somebody from, I think, somewhere from Germany maybe, very profound individual who presents every religion of the world. And he's a Christian. I think he's like an Orthodox Christian, if I'm not mistaken. But he's got all these deep presentations on Meister Eckhart and Meister Eckhart's sermons and Orthodox Christianity and how that compares with non-dualism and how that compares with traditional Judaism and Christianity. It's like very, very profound stuff, right? He's got a nice beard, and I'm pretty sure he follows Orthodox Christianity. I don't remember the name right now. But if you want to know, I can send you these links. So that's scholarship, and that's good. I mean, in my personal opinion, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's good to study as much as you can from other places. But at the same time, if there is solidification in one place, it has to make sense inside. Just because somebody else, 10 people are trying to convince an individual that follow Jesus, that doesn't mean that person is going to follow Jesus, or doesn't mean the person understands what that means. They have to actually go into it and see, what does that mean? And does it make sense to oneself? The same thing is true with like the various traditions in India. There are all kinds of worships and devotional practices, and there's also all kinds of scriptural study. What makes sense inside? So I'll give you an example. Take Joseph Campbell, anthropologist. Joseph Campbell was a great anthropologist, and you can look him up on YouTube. He's got fantastic perspectives. But he spent many years in India studying non-dualistic Vedanta. He studied the various traditions of the world and whatnot. He came to his own perspective on it. And in doing so, a lot of his perspective of the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Islam tradition was influenced by the Eastern perspectives and the field of anthropology. And he combined it together, and then he gave his own perspective as a scholar and as a practitioner. I think he practiced some mixed version of these different traditions. I don't know exactly what he practiced, but there are many books that he's written. There are interviews and presentations. But he was an anthropology professor. Right? Now, he was a practitioner of some tradition, but I think it was that he mixed it together somehow. I don't think he was practicing any one particular one. But anyway, I have to look into that some more. And there's also the Joseph Campbell archives. There's quite a few. There's so much publication behind that. And he's a very well-known anthropologist who looked at religions of the world, the stories of the great traditions, what they mean, and then he came to his own analysis and his own conclusion. And then he talks about higher consciousness and these things also. The reason I'm mentioning this today, without going into the specifics further yet on the Old Testament, which we will do, the reason I'm mentioning this is because just with our small group of people that are listening to these ideas and all, everyone comes from a different background. You have your own path, let's say, that you may already be following. My humble request only is to go further into it and study it further. Really go into it thoroughly. So that half-baked knowledge is not going to work here. That can cause a lot of problems. You see, it's like it's a silly example. If you're making blueberry muffins, right? Have you ever tried to make blueberry muffins and then you pull them out too early, and then they're half cooked? You cannot eat this. Oh, this is not. Put it back in. It has to be proper. It shouldn't be overcooked. Also, it needs to be cooked in the right amount. So you can learn from a blueberry muffin all this thing. This very simple thing, actually. It's like that. This half-baked knowledge is not going to be helpful. If you're a Jewish person, go into Judaism much more thoroughly and understand it properly. And then see where your faith takes you. If you believe in Jesus, try to understand what the Old Testament is saying, New Testament is saying. Go into it thoroughly as much as you can. Read commentaries, studies, write questions. Go further. Spend more time in this. It surprises me sometimes why people don't spend more time in their own faith. If you spend more time in that and really properly study it while learning from others, learn from all. Don't hate, don't dislike anybody. But whatever has resonated with one, maybe out of tradition, maybe out of family, maybe out of one's own desire to follow a particular path, go into it further and see what's in it. Go deeper into it. Now, it's going to take time. I mean, in my last 25, 30 years on this, people who have done that, I would say it requires 2 to 3 years. I would say, like, as an example, if you are a practicing Christian or you want to practice Christianity, get a commentary, like the MacArthur's commentary or like the theological study. Get one of those really in-depth commentaries on the Bible that really explain it from, in a lot of depth. Then there's a lot of material available online for free. You don't have to pay for anything these days anyway. Almost information is pretty much readily available. Spend some time, not some time, spend considerable time, particularly if this is of paramount importance. That this life is to realize higher truth. Maybe it's through Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or any branch of Hinduism or whatever it might be. I want to realize something much greater than simply eat, drink, and be merry and die one day. That's it. It's something much, much greater than that. Well, then these traditions are available for exploration. So two or three points for today. I'll close in just 3 minutes here. I really want to try to stick to time from now on as much as I can. And that is 3 points. Point number 1, if you are open, if we in general, humanity is open, people are open to something more than just materialism, then the religious and traditions of the world, meditative traditions of the world are available. Study them, select a couple of them, and try to practice at least one of them. Try to practice one of them and see what it feels like, what the practices are. And every tradition has their own practices. Like in our angel wing program, we do some generic meditations and all that, but we cannot go into that level of depth like churches might go into, or theological seminaries might go into, or Buddhist monasteries might go into, or Buddhist teachers, or Hindu temples with various mantras and rituals. We are not set up to do any of that kind of thing here. So that you would have to do that on your own, and explore, but try to explore this further. So that's the second point for today. Practical point. Spend time in the tradition that you want to spend time in, and be open-minded. Nobody should be fanatical. That's to harm anybody else or anything like that. That's not spirituality or religion at all. That's damaging the whole world already. So that shouldn't even play a part in this. But with regards to development of one's faith, the theological doctrines, various ideas that we have been covering so far, I just wanted to just talk about this today at this point before going further into even more intricate ideas of the Old Testament, simply because we don't want to create confusion, but at the same time, this requires time. It requires faith and it requires patience. These are two big qualities that are needed to progress in this religious path. Thank you. So these are two big qualities. It's in the Sanskrit language. Actually, in India, there was a very enlightened saint, and he used to call this. He used to say Shraddha and Saburi. Shraddha means faith. Saburi means patience. And I do want to cover. We will cover the famous sages, enlightened beings, or evolved beings from all the traditions in this. Do some presentations. There's all kinds of videos, documentaries. Everything is available, but a little bit at a time. You cannot drink. If you're thirsty, you cannot drink the whole ocean. Remember this. So it's not possible. We need to take a glass of fresh water and drink it, and that'll be good for us. Maybe 2 glasses. You cannot drink the whole river. You cannot drink, certainly not the whole ocean or the whole river. No, it's like that. These traditions are so vast. They're oceanic, each and every one of them. Just Christianity by itself. It's vast. It is boundless. I mean, that's how there are thousands of commentaries and perspectives and in-depth analyses of all kinds. There are practitioners of all kinds. It's very profound. Every tradition is like that because it's taken time for it to develop. Like the Hindu tradition, what we call Hindu tradition, Indian tradition, that's over 10,000 years old. I mean, nobody knows how old it really is even, and it's very difficult to understand, and it's not easy to make heads or tails of it, so not easy, but it can be done a little bit at a time. Before you know it, this year will go by, next year will go by, we'll get to year 3 or 4, we'll continue just year by year here, and so much development will happen. But if you want to go further in your own development, if you are a student of the New Testament, see, I would put it to you this way. If you're a believer in Jesus, become a deep student of the New Testament. If you're a believer in Krishna, become a deep student of the Gita and the Bhagavatam. If you're a deep Jewish individual, go into this Torah and the Talmud and go into the depth of that. You'll find something fantastic there. Rather than superficial arguments and discussions which have very little meaning, go into it thoroughly. If there's a particular denomination one is attracted to, some people on our online have talked about Unity Church and stuff like that, then go into that. Maybe they've already gone into it, or so everyone's journey is their own. It just depends, right? Where we are, where we're headed. Always learn from all. The third point, I'll close. I'm a little over time here. Third point is keep mind open. Learn from everyone and follow the path that makes sense to you, that's resonating inside. Follow that and go deeper into it. Study more about it. The biggest mistake anybody can make, including me, I'm telling myself this first, and that is that I think I understand this as thoroughly as I think I do. No, there is a lot more to it than what we think we understand. And whether it's the biblical verses, whether it's the Gita verses, whether it's any of the scriptures, it's a lot. There's profound truths in that, but it takes time. All right, so with that, I'll stop here. We do want to close at 8 o'clock, try to stick to time, which is important for us. And we'll open it up here for discussion, conversation, anything you'd like to say.